for 20 minutes. Sir.
Good afternoon. On the outset, let me thank the organizers, Professor Moorthy and friends from UGM for the invitation. It's always nice on an annual basis to meet old friends. I've known Professor Umar for the last 10, 12 years, if I'm not mistaken. It's nice to see a lot of old friends as well as new acquaintances. Okay. Is it audible? Right. Okay. Thank you. My name is Ravi. I come from Malaysia. I work at a university called University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Kebangsaan means national, so it's a national university. It's the second biggest university in Malaysia. It's a public university. I teach international relations, primarily on war, conflict. So this is something which I do on a daily basis. All right. But prior to my university position, I was a bureaucrat in the Malaysian Civil Service at various ministries. My last appointment was at the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation. That's where I first met Professor Darrell and the bioethics fraternity. The topic I'm going to talk to you today is about conflict. Is it an inherent nature of mankind? This is actually a part of a book project which I'm editing with Professor Panir Selvam of Chennai, who's not able to come here. And in that book project, we were looking at, the whole notion of conflict and humanity, and to what extent that, the very nature of mankind is conflictual in nature or able to inflict conflict. So on that basis, I'm going to use the slides. I know it's after lunch, it's a bit difficult to keep awake, right? So I have a daunting task to keep you awake, so I got a nice picture. Can anybody tell me what is that photo about? Can you? That's right. That is a vivid picture of 9/11 while the two towers collapsed. And if we were to look at this as a turning point in history, so I used to have this notion about turning point in history. First World War, Second World War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, 9/11, and of course now Donald Trump. These are events that will turn, turning point.
He's going to be in the future.
But he's already, right. You see, the problem of international relations is perception of threat is as real as threat itself. So people are perceiving the threat itself. Right. All right. So what I'm going to talk to you today is essentially about looking at conflict and some discussions about conflict and humanity and whether it's an inherent nature of mankind. Next slide, please. Now this is, just to start, this is the state of global peace. Now I'm not sure which country you can see from here, which category are you, country that you come from. It's from the range of most peaceful and the least peaceful. Right, so I'm from Malaysia, so I'm in green, the second level of green, so I'm peaceful. I think the most peaceful would probably be New Zealand, Darrell, and probably Canada. All right, where's Indonesia? Indonesia, same category with Malaysia. All right. So this is just to show you the conflict regions around the world. And we know that in any part of the world, especially in the Asia Pacific, we have problems, violent conflicts that is taking place between states and also within the states itself. Either civil war or fight between ethnic religious groups or possible conflict within states, not only over land but also on resources, including the sea. Next, please. Now, this is another chart showing that terrorist incident, because the last few speakers we were talking about the Arab-Israeli-Palestinian issue and few other issues that involves conflict. I think it's quite an interesting depiction of the kind of problems that we have with regard to terrorism. Terrorist incidents and death is on the rise. Of course, some claim the number of terrorist incidents have actually gone down a bit, but the intensity of this terrorist attack has actually gone up, right, in terms of death and all that. So terrorism is actually a worldwide phenomenon. It is cross-border, right? So you have trans-boundary terrorists, actually. In fact, Malaysia also produces very good bomb makers, including Nordin Matop, who was very active in Indonesia. Okay, next please. Now let me start with the idea of a state of conflict. Okay. Now the paper deals with the question whether conflict is an inherent trait of human nature. Now if we were to look at the history of mankind, the history of man, we have seen the colossal destruction, all right, of their own species and to the environment, as we have seen in the two world wars and all the conflicts that we are experiencing. Through the scourge of war, violent conflicts, and unsustainable use of habitat. Ironically, despite being social and religious, human seems to have the capacity to inflict intense cruelty to its fellow human beings for differences of opinion and differences in terms of interest. Now, essentially, by drawing from some recent history of human endeavor, the presentation or the paper asks whether the propensity of conflict is an innate makeup or nature of human being. It also examines why humans faltered miserably at managing conflict, crises and disputes at many spheres of existence. Now next, can you go back to the slide, earlier slide? This is just to show you the conflict within man and man, conflict within man and society, man and nature, man with himself, which is interpersonal conflict. Now, if we were to look at the picture itself, from a psychological perspective, point of view, conflict or the propensity for conflict is an essential makeup of being human. I think all of us know that we have, we can be a bit, in terms of our own behavior and whatnot, it's a bit conflictual, and all how we manage with our spouses, in our workplace and whatnot. Okay, each time individuals form association with other individuals, all right, they are entering into relationships where choices and decisions are made. Therefore, in making these choices, the existential approach suggests that humans place a lot of importance to the attachment of anxiety, which is a core component why we tend to be conflictual. The reality in making choices and decisions is that it is always going to be, it's not always going to be tranquil or assured, or in fact agreed. In making decisions, one has to consider the possibility that I may get it wrong. And if so, what do I do with it? Then, is this decision that I'm making going to affect others? And if so, in what way? So therefore, I must be prepared for reaction. Now this is the behavior of human beings that is also reflected in the behavior of state. Why do I need to buy weapons? I need to buy weapons because I perceive some level of threat from my neighbors. Whether the threat is real or not, you're not sure. But as long as my neighbor has some level of weapons or some capability for destruction, so therefore it must be used. So this is the idea of a security dilemma, that you think that's constant chaos in that sense, all right? So the feeling, can I just also look at the same thing again? All right. So there is also what we call a mental struggle. All right. Now, what we mean by mental struggle is essentially arising from the opposing demand or impulses, all right, within the person, especially to manage opposing desires and ideals. The core problem of internal conflict is usually related to some ethical, emotional, or moral dilemmas. All right. Also related to decision-making problems. It can manifest in varying scales, from a more mundane choices or decisions, like what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, what attire I'm going to wear for tomorrow's session, okay, to more important things in life, like choosing a partner, buying a house, applying for a job in certain universities, I don't know, right? So these are the things that, different scales. These conflicts may be harder to manage should the individuals find it difficult to interpret his or her innermost struggles. In a broader term, the internal conflict has been used to describe armed conflict as well within a country such as the civil war. However, I'm not going to address this in this paper. Now, in contrast, if we were to look at, in contrast to internal conflict, the external nature of human conflict culminates from sources external to the self or non-self. The non-self sources, such as other persons or other groups, societies or organizations, can also create conflict situations. Conflict between self and others or other persons is called interpersonal conflict. Such conflicts happen not only because of differences in opinion, but also it can also be due to personalities, but primarily as a result of incompatible choices or desires or beliefs between individuals. Now, although non-desirable interpersonal conflict often help in personal growth to develop relations with others through adjustments of beliefs and desires. I think this is very important as we go through life. Although interacting with other people in our life is sometimes can be problematic, but it teaches us how to manage our relations with others and live in societies. Nevertheless, a third-party intervention in the form of mediation may be necessary if such conflicts becomes unmanageable. When conflict happens between self and members in a group or team, it is called intergroup conflict. It is usually a result of incompatibilities or misunderstanding or disagreement or differing personalities among group members. In the dynamic of the group, some amount of conflict between team members can be productive. It leads to healthy competition, as it may facilitate better decision making and team objectives. However, team leaders should not control the degree of conflict, so that it does not disturb the harmony and the cohesiveness of the team. Now, there is also conflict between groups. I'm not going to go, I think it's quite, the picture itself is self-explanatory. Now, from a societal angle, it's also important. So, social conflict is also an important feature of the management of conflict, which is a struggle for agency and power in society. Social conflict or group conflict occurs when two or more actors oppose each other in social interaction, reciprocally exerting social power in an effort to attain scarce and incompatible goals and to prevent the opponent from attaining them. It is a social relationship wherein the action is oriented intentionally for carrying out the actor's own will against the resistance of other party members. Now, can we move on to the next slide, please? Okay, now this is basically a definition. There are so many definitions when we talk about conflict. I think this is the most common definition, which is actually about conflict is an expressed struggle. Right? Conflict can also be manifest and latent. If it is a latent conflict, is we have problems with our spouses or with our bosses, then we keep quiet. All right, so that becomes a latent conflict. All right, the ones that you react to that disagreement or displeasure, so therefore it takes the form of a manifest conflict situation. In Malaysia, I think in Indonesia we also have the concept of amok. Do you have this here as well, Indonesia? That generally we are all very peaceful people, we are not confrontational, we are not conflictual, so therefore we normally suppress the feeling internally until one fine day we burst out and we'll take the parang and run around. Alright, so we have that also in Malaysia. Okay, now this is basically the definition. Alright, essentially when you talk about conflict, it is the feeling of being in conflict is actually non-desirable. Sensation experienced when an individual believes or desires run contrary to the situation or position that the individual is confronted. Okay, so this is the definition. So we are talking about incompatibility of goals. Now the second one, now this is why the notion of conflict is an innate nature of human beings as we go through the process of life, interacting within ourselves and with the external world, with individuals, with nature, with societies and all that. Why are we, in essence, conflictual? Now there are three people here, academics who have read. Burton says that the idea of conflict stems from human needs, unsatisfied human needs. This is basically, we go to Harvard School, business school as well, they teach about, when you talk about negotiations, they call it balancing the needs, right? So unsatisfied or unmet human needs. So therefore, when we talk about conflict resolution, we are talking about the difference between needs and interests. Needs are something which is important, that you cannot do away without it, so therefore needs must be addressed, whereas interests can be negotiated. The second one, Galton says that inequality, the source of conflict is inequality embedded in social structures. Now this is very true when you talk about the post-colonial period, all right, where you have communities, you have the sense of marginalization, the sense of injustice, inequality, lack of equity, all right. So this comes about when people feel that they are unjustly treated. So therefore the social structure itself bring about some very strong feeling of inequality, which is the basis of much of the ethno-religious conflict in the region, right? Okay. We have 3 minutes. Thank you. The third one is actually when you talk about conflict, it's about not always dysfunctional. I mean, this is a good side of conflict. Conflict can be positive, right? Some level of conflict, it's good for relationship to move forward. I must say that to my wife often. Right. So you have all these different notions of conflict. Next, please. Right. This is a conflict continuum. This is basically when we look at managing conflict. Conflict management essentially goes through this process, right? Either you negotiate among yourselves to try to settle disputes, or you go for third-party intervention. It can be in the form of a mediation, or arbitration, or litigation, or adjudication, things of that sort. Then there also more subtle form of international. You have diplomacy, international relations, and international courts. If you can't settle the disputes, so you bring to ICJ, like for example. Then you have also other means. Of course, you have more violent means, like for example, military action, civil war, and you go into war. Okay, next please. The way that we manage conflict has from unassertive to assertive, all right, unassertive, and also cooperative to uncooperative, all right. So this is the continuum that where it depends, all right. If it is a state, like for example, if it is related to state sovereignty, but usually states will try to embrace a more assertive posturing when it comes to conflict resolution, especially when they have greater power. Next please. Now, so why human nature is fundamentally conflictual? There must be a reason, right? Right, next. Right, the one probable reason is maybe it is an inherent makeup of our genes, alright? Conflict, violence and war are results of an evolutionary ancient predisposition that humans may have inherited from our siblings or our cousins, alright? When we last shared the common ancestor with the chimpanzees. I mean, you may agree with this or you may not agree with this, but it's fine, okay? So there's some level of conflict, all right, within the human being. So next please. Now this is another research done pertaining to hunter-gatherer societies, okay, and it is done by anthropologists from Finland, and when they looked at certain communities, all right, ancient communities, they found that although conflict appears, violent conflicts is there, all right, there are conflict, violent deaths, fighting among groups and whatnot. Usually the conflict arises for personal grudges involving women and also stealing. So women are the source of problem. Then we have also group conflict, a typical pattern of feud between families and revenge killing. There has been there as well, right? But there is little evidence that the hunter-gatherer societies were in constant state of violence, all right, with the other rival groups, okay? So this is a finding that suggests that while conflict is there in the history of mankind, but mankind are also capable or have the ability to manage those conflicts. Next please. Now if we were to look at the birth of modern faith system, I like to use the word faith system rather than religion, we find that, if you like the Abrahamic tradition as well, you find that it is a response to chaos. Much of the modern religion, of course you have the ancient religions from India, from China and whatnot. The evolution is more gradual, but the modern religion, the rise of modern religion are actually have been a response to societal chaos that happened during that period of time. Next please. Now another source of problem which is extremely bad at this point of time is the idea of state. Because after the Treaty of Westphalia, when modern state came into being, states were taught the lessons, or rather, the information that the primary actor, they are the primary actor. Everything else is lesser than them. All right. So therefore, state can act. All right. Self-help meaning self-interest. So therefore, they can have moral standards which differ. They can have one moral standard for themselves, and they can have another moral standards for the rest of the world. All right. So state also are taught that they must be cautioned. They must be wary about their neighbors. The constant state of fear. What's happening with your neighbor. All right. And that has given the way to organized violence, and some say, state-sanctioned terrorism and whatnot. So this has led to further expression of conflict and violence. Next please. Now, one suggestion I would like to make is to look at the Eastern tradition. All right. Although there are some work has been done on the Indic and Sino civilization, which has existed from before the arrival of modern state system. Now there have been also wars and conflict within those civilization, but there have been also conflict resolution methodologies that have been practiced by those civilizations. I think perhaps we need to look at it closer as an alternative to dispute resolution. Next, please. All right. Now, this is something I would like. This is my last slide, I think. Perhaps we need to reimagine the idea of conflict and security. This is the idea of human security which has been promoted the last decade or so. One of the notion of conflict, when you talk about international conflict, is the idea of security in the minds of states are usually security for the state. It's not really security for you and me. It's security for the state. So one of the push that the human security discourse brings about is to bring the focus of security from state concern to human concern. To what extent it is achievable, I'm not very sure, but there are movements towards it. A lot of people, academics, are writing about this as well. So I think that's my last slide. Do I have any more? Can I just click? Oh, all right. And we also need to invest on conflict resolution methodologies. These are some of it, all right? How you compete, collaborate, compromise, avoid, you accommodate. There are different strategies that you can use, all right? Next, please. And this is the one. This is actually the conflict cycle, that we need to break the conflict cycle in order for us to build peace, building resilience. All right. So thank you. I think that's all. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Professor Ravichandran.
From Yonsei University for next year host our Yonsei University will be the venue of the next year. And I'm very pleased to be here, and thank you very much for the morning session. And I was intended to ask something to the morning presenters, but I did not. So, including the morning session and this session, I want to ask as you know, now the cutting edge bio research enable us to regenerate our human beings. So I want to ask, what is the human being? What is the definition of human being? And is it possible to manage or modify the human being? And I want to ask in the morning session, we can learn from the religion, but the bio research or bioethics can ask to the religion if the eternal life can be given by the science. Is it right or wrong? The kind of things we should discuss in the bioethics fields. So I want to ask. Thank you.
To whom should you address the questions? To everyone? It was very, very generic and nobody was speaking specific about the subject. Professor Sunarto, please.
No, I think it was me who was number 2, yeah. I have a short, okay. I'm Byron Good from Harvard Medical School, professor of medical anthropology at Harvard Medical School, and I have a short question for each of the 4 speakers. Number 1 for Prof. Paul Komesarov. I really appreciated your attempt to give a very clear set of definitions to work with. I'm left with 2 questions. I still don't understand what's the difference when you call this an ethical issue as opposed to a social issue, etc. That is, in what way are your set of definitions, which require communications, etc., what's the difference when you call those ethical as opposed to something else? And then the second question, since you deal in settings of profound inequality of power, it is one issue to have communication between peoples who are relatively equal, but of course precisely what Franz Fanon was speaking about, were settings of profound inequality of power, which is exactly what is the case in Israel. And how does that affect what you try to do? Second question for Prof. Mary Jo. I just would like to hear you say a bit more about exactly how you think mental health or psychosocial interventions contribute to a peace process. I know we thought when we were working in Aceh that sometimes in villages, some of the people we saw themselves with long-standing injuries and long-standing PTSD, meaning reliving of conflict, that by relieving those it might contribute to the peace process. But I wonder if you would just say a bit more about how you think mental health interventions can contribute to peace. For Prof. Omar, it's really the same question that I asked also from Paul. That is, in the discussion, again, in settings of profound inequality of power, for instance, between Israel, what role can simply communications play, not at interpersonal contacts, but actually at resolving conflicts at the level of states? And finally, for Prof. Ravi Moorthy, when you mentioned you were going to talk about human nature, I felt like it was only the picture of the chimpanzee that began to ask the question, really, what do you mean by human nature? And one might take from Freud this idea that human beings do not only have the ability for conflict, of course, but for murderous rage, for murdering each other, for killing each other, for torturing each other, and that, as Freud said, Thanatos, the death instinct, and Eros, the love instinct, are actually very closely tied to each other. And I wonder, like, exactly, I still don't know what theory of human nature you have. Okay.
Thank you. And right at the back, please. Move forward.
Good afternoon. I'm Shaki from the... Hello, yes. I'm from the Philippines. So my question is regarding the issue of conflict. So what can you say about the lack of or the silent or non-existent moral demands on institutions progressing or propagating neo-fatalisms in the world, especially in connection with neo-colonization and neoliberalism or neoliberalization. So as opposed to those who are reactionary to the impacts of neoliberalism or neo-colonization in the world. So for example, these so-called terrorists, or they might be terrorists to some states, but they are revolutionaries for other states. So these are reactions of the periphery to the core. So why is there such a demand on morality, ethics, let's say, on institutions such as the church or a certain religion, let's say Islam as a religion or Christianity as a religion, as opposed to those who are progressing neoliberalism or neo-colonization? Thank you.
Okay. Very much. And last one, please.
Yes, I'm Miyako Takagi, come from Japan. I have a question for Ravi. Yes. You mentioned that the conflict come from the gene of the hunting people, and we are the not hunting people. We are origin is the agricultural people, and still, but we have the conflict, especially before Second World War. We have a lot of conflict for the other country, and so I want to have the mention from the Navy.
Okay, I think four people has been raising some questions. And I would like to give a chance in order from Professor Al-Komisarov to make some responses.
Thanks for the wonderful questions. I won't respond to each of them specifically, but I think Byron's questions probably encompassed all of them in a way. So I'll focus on Byron's questions, and I think that'll take in some of the other comments that people made. Ethics is the kind of discourse that engages in relation to values. It's not the only discourse we have. There are scientific discourses, religious, aesthetic, and other sorts of things. So ethical discourse is a particular kind of communication. Communication can be distorted or obstructed in many different ways, and the intervention of the institutions of power is one important, critical a form of obstruction or disruption of ethical discourses in general. An important, but maybe though the best way to answer the question that you were asking is to go back to Israel and Palestine, which was the focus of your question and the focus, of course, of my talk, and then the one that followed. It's important to recognise that the nature of the conflict is highly specific. I don't think one can talk about conflict in general abstract terms. In fact, I have a problem with the idea of conflict as a general category. I don't think there's any such thing. And the conflict that arises in personal relationships is really quite different from the conflict that is generated by competition between capitalist forces in the late 20th century or late 19th century, early 20th century or whatever. There are completely different dynamics and completely different outcomes. So I think it's a bit of an intellectual sleight of hand simply to call them all conflict. In the Middle East, the circumstances of that generated the relationship between Palestine and Israel are determined by the way in which Israel came into existence in the first place, the way in which the concept of Palestine was in fact a response to the implantation of Zionism as European capitalism within a particular setting. So that the relationship between the Palestinians and the Jewish Israelis and the Zionists is something that's actually ingrained in the cultural relationship between them. And that is something which actually formed the structure of the communication that subsequently occurred. There are many levels at which the conflict occurs. In particular, the conflict between the regimes is very different between the conflict between individuals or the civil society groups. This gets back to the point that I just made. The regimes themselves, on all sides, the Israeli regime, which is the most conservative, reactionary regime Israel's ever seen, and the Palestinian regimes, which are largely corrupt in their own ways, the regimes are locked into the conflict. They depend on the perpetuation of the conflict for their own existence. And clearly they have an interest in the conflict. The interest of most of the individuals in the West Bank, in Gaza, in Israel proper, and so on, is not in the perpetuation of the conflict at all, but quite different. So there are, again here, two quite different dynamics that are operating. So we can't talk about generic communication or generic conflict. We've got to think about the specific structural determinants of both the nature of the conflict and the communication and the possibilities for moving out of it. So the kind of, when I spoke about reconciliation, clearly there's reconciliation potentially at a diplomatic level, but actually the kind of reconciliation to which I was referring was reconciliation which was embedded at the civil society level. And I think there really is the opportunity to move forward here. And our strategy needs to be to foster and to kind of foment, if you like, communicative links between civil society groups in Israel and Palestine and in the rest of the world. It's not a matter of simply making connections between Israel and Israelis and Palestinians. That's actually barely possible at the present time because of limitations imposed by both regimes. From the Israeli point of view, the cooperation with the Palestinians is difficult for all sorts of reasons. From the Palestinian point of view, it's actively resisted on the basis that this is normalising the occupation, so that there's really very little contact between Israelis in Israel and Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank at the present time. So our opportunities are different. They involve establishing relationships between civil society groups within the region and outside it. So what we're trying to do, what my group and a group that I'm involved in, and I invite other people here to join, is to establish a series of parallel relationships between civil society groups within the region and outside the region. And these will take the form of multiple micro-partnerships between groups of women in Gaza and a group of women in Melbourne, between a group of kids doing rap in Bethlehem and a group of kids doing rap in Los Angeles, and so on. It's like a kind of humanitarian version of Airbnb. It's not the humanitarian aid regime that depends on highly concentrated, centralised, bureaucratic processes of control that pour in large amounts of money and have very little to do with what happens at the community level, which breed dependency and corruption. Rather, it's a process of establishing devolved, democratic connections, proliferating micro-partnerships between civil society groups. Now, that doesn't solve the conflict, but what it could potentially do is establish or to initiate a new, a novel form of social relationships, or a novel social dynamic, if you like, a different set of alliances which can set off, which can spark, if you like, a new kind of social dynamic. The region is stuck in an impasse at the moment. The impasse is largely created by the regimes, as I said. What we need to do to break the impasse is to open up the possibility for new kinds of relationships. Where will they lead? We don't know, and it will not be up to us to determine that. What we hope is that they'll lead to something new, that they'll create new possibilities. They'll go in a direction no one's ever gone before. At least that will be different. Whether it will be ultimately the peace that everyone hopes for in the Middle East, no one can tell.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite Professor Mary Jo Good to make some responses, if you'd like.
Professor Byron asked a question that's fairly straightforward, and one that we dealt with our teams, our clinicians that we were working for. They tried to treat people both through listening and medication to allow them, or make it possible for them to move the horrifying, traumatic memories from the present to the past. And by moving it from the present to the past, these people who really recovered in extraordinary ways were able to think about the future and to think about what they needed to do in everyday life without being incapacitated to do so. It's a fairly simple kind of medical and psychological process that happens when people have enough sleep, and so the medication allowed people to sleep, and when people had the kind of caring that these young doctors and nurses were giving to the patients. And it was only over, 3 months for some patients, 6 months for others, a year for others. But it was extraordinarily impactful. It was both something that was very gratifying for the doctors and nurses who also had lived in this traumatized society, and taught them how to be excellent physicians with a capacity to treat mental illness, to recognize it, to treat it. And it also allowed them to express their humanity. We're asking them, what's a human? To express the best of themselves in helping others. And those people who were treated by them were truly grateful for the ear, for the listening, and a place to tell their stories. And there is a little bit of a crude comment, if you don't mind. The way people express what they were saying is that it's very much that they were throwing out on the other what they had been feeling, and then it stuck to the other. So initially, some of the doctors and nurses had secondary PTSD from listening to the stories that happened. But it was as though if you got it out, it was enough. The other thing was that when people were given both apologies and money, that was an incredibly powerful social pill and peace pill. The money pill, the peace pill, the kind of commitment from the society to them that they were being invested in also helped them to put into the past what had been hell as in the present. And what was in the present sometimes is being experienced in the present. Sometimes it's 15, 20 years ago, as well as very recent. And so it was an amazing experience, actually, living through this 5 years of work, very intensive post-conflict work. Thank you. I didn't clearly hear the other questions, so I stop with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Manicho. Next opportunity I would like to give to Professor Marangoroye.
Try to answer Professor Andrew's question. That in my opinion, dialogue is the key for rebuilding mutual trust between conflicting nations. So dialogue is very important. And started step by step. Started individually, and then started in the social level, and if possible, in the parliament. After that, hopefully, that we can influence the government. Of course, take a time, but we should struggle for peace. This is my opinion. And like the other means, such as war or something like that. But we should keep dialogue, and dialogue. And then I would like to answer the third question. How the role of the religious leader in preventing neocolonialism or neoliberalism? I think all religion is the same. That we are created by Creator in different color, in different places, maybe also in different faith. But God always said, in order that you should know each other, you should help each other. There is no difference between white and black and color. We are human beings. we are the same people of God, so we should make a friendship among human beings. This is the basic principle in, I believe, all religion. And the first question about the definition of human being is not very easy to answer, but academically, human being is the highest and more complex living organism. This I taught by our professor at university. Thank you very much.
The next one, response from Professor Moorthy.
Okay, this is a question that I'm asking as well. Actually, I have no such correlation established at this point of time. I'm also looking at this for the paper. But the reason that I put the picture of the chimpanzee there is to show some kind of similarity in terms of behavior. Like for example, the behavior, the need for us for security, like in that sense, security from protection from bodily harm, like for example, a sense of security for other aspects, competition, like for example, for needs. All right. So first is security, then comes to other needs that includes food, territory, power relations between members and whatnot. So I'm just looking at that and trying to make a comparison whether there is a genetic makeup of humans that has some similarity in terms of what do you call that, certain characteristic of such, if at all that is true. The second question, similar to what the professor has mentioned, when we talk about this idea of political makeup, or rather the theoretical makeup, which I'm trying to assert here, essentially when I look at nature, I'm not really theorized it in that sense, on which basis. I'm just looking at the idea of human beings being conflictual. There is a innate ability for humans to be conflictual and to inflict violence to a great extent. That is the whole history of mankind have experienced that. I'm also looking at the idea of moral reasoning based on the individual's ethics itself to manage those. Now when we talk about human and conflict, essentially we talk about resolution of that conflict. Right? When conflict is already there, how do you actually manage it, right? So primarily it comes from within, which is actually your individual ethics, right? It can also come, and that within it can come from your own notion of what is right and wrong. It comes to moral reasoning. Or it may also be certain values that you are inculcated with, either religion or certain values your mom and dad teach you or your religious teacher, right? Or can also be from external sources or principles, like for example norms and values of society, or rules and regulations within the country, or a code of ethics of your own professions and whatnot. But these are our denominators or influencing parameters that actually to a certain extent influence decisions. Then of course, the idea of conflict resolution, I was mentioning in my slides, but not made it clear, is sometimes conflict requires some level of assistance or structure in order for human beings to resolve or to manage or mitigate such conflicts. One good example, the keynote speaker today is also a marriage broker. Is it a marriage broker? Marriage, not a broker. What word do you use? Where's the professor? Is he around? No, he's a marriage counselor, right? So a third-party intervention is also very important. Now, we spoke about, Professor Umar spoke about the idea of, conflict resolutions or looking at dialogue in managing the Arab-Israeli peace process, in a sense. Yes, true, dialogue is important. At the same time, there must also be a structure. I realize that power structure is also an important component when it comes to conflict, especially state conflict. Power structure. Sometimes third-party intervention. You can't. I know this. One of the problems of the Arab-Israeli peace process is actually the support of the United States. But you can't actually remove United States from the fabrics or the dynamics of the peace process, right? For some level of credible peace. Then, of course, the idea that we always need to bear in mind, the idea of trust in conflict. The idea of trust in conflict. One of the reasons that the Arab-Israeli peace process is so difficult is because the trust, especially when you sit on the negotiating table and you have protracted conflict when people have been murdered, right? And you have looking at the other side of the table and you say, oh, this guy has murdered my family, and therefore it's very difficult for you to reconcile and look at put everything aside and say, okay, let's negotiate, it's a bit difficult in that sense. So therefore, confidence building measures must be there. You need to build confidence with the parties, right? So trust must be built in order for us to move forward, especially when it comes to major conflicts. So this is what I meant by balancing of interests, balancing of needs, balancing the feeling of justice, the feeling of, if at all that the feeling is something wrong has been done to a particular party. Then, of course, the dynamics of negotiations, either third party or probably using the Norwegian group that we find in the GAM issue in Aceh, right? It was not so successful in the in Sri Lanka, for that matter. So the system must be. I think it's a concerted thing when you talk about conflict. Thank you.
From speakers. Let me just make brief summary, just keynote that I made by listening to the speakers and the responses. First, bioethic has become manifest as like soft approach or something which embedded in the way that we are doing, being a professional, being an activist, or being governance, or those who exercise power and so forth. So the embedded aspect of bioethic, I think, is what has been expressed in the session. Secondly, the engagement or movement, if you like, has been typically rely on human being in the society, and therefore word like civil society has become explanatory in this discussion. And the engagement in many ways are what making the ethic manifest and fruitful. And the principle of making it workable is the willingness to be empathic or blocking communication barriers, and at the same time trying to keep a balance or equality in communications. And state has been having double faces. On the one hand, it's possible to create like construction in Aceh, but in other cases, it is the state that creates ethical problem in our daily life. I think these are the points that I note during this session. Thank you very much, and let us give some applause to the speakers.